This video is about hygiene lies that sound insane today but were once considered smart, healthy, and even luxurious. People brushed teeth with urine, swallowed parasites for beauty, avoided bathing on purpose, and trusted doctors who refused to wash their hands. These are 40 disgusting hygiene myths from the past that still fool people today, and every single one actually happened. 1. Ancient Romans had yellow rotting teeth because they had no toothpaste. You might think everyone in the past smiled like a jack-o'-lantern, but the Romans were actually obsessed with pearly whites, and their secret ingredient was absolutely disgusting. They used mouthwash made entirely of human urine because the ammonia inside it is a natural bleach. It gets even crazier because the rich elite didn't just want any old local pee, they wanted the premium imported stuff from Portugal, which was considered the champagne of mouthwashes. Imagine being so fancy that you pay extra shipping costs just to gargle someone else's liquid waste every morning. Nero even taxed the pee trade because apparently selling buckets of urine was the most profitable business in the entire empire. 2. Ancient mummies were treated with deep respect as historical treasures. You think of mummies sitting safely behind glass in a museum, but for hundreds of years, rich Europeans thought they were a delicious snack. Wealthy aristocrats and confused doctors believed that grinding up a preserved dead body and drinking it in tea was the ultimate cure for headaches and stomach aches. They called it mumia. And there was a massive trade where people would dig up ancient Egyptian kings just to turn them into human powder for a rich guy's breakfast. It is wild to think that the final resting place of a mighty pharaoh was inside the digestive tract of a British noble who thought eating a corpse was a great way to start the morning. 3. Those massive gravity-defying hairstyles were held up by magic. In the 18th century, the only way to get those towering wigs to stay up was to use huge amounts of pig lard and beef tallow. Women would walk around with pounds of animal fat plastered onto their heads, which smelled like a greasy kitchen hot dog whenever the sun came out. The fat was so delicious to pests that women had to sleep with wire cages around their heads to stop mice and rats from burrowing into the hair to make a nest. Imagine trying to look sexy and flirtatious at a party, while knowing that a family of rodents is currently eating dinner inside your hairdo. 4. Medieval castle floors were clean stone surfaces smelling of fresh herbs. Movies always show kings walking on pristine floors, but in reality they were walking on a compost heap of pure nastiness. People used to cover the floors with straw to catch dirt, but instead of cleaning it up, they just added a new layer of fresh straw on top of the old garbage. After a few decades, the floor became a sandwich of rotting food, dog mess, and spilled ale that was teeming with microscopic life. If you tripped and fell in a great hall, you were landing in 20 years of fermented dinner scraps. It was basically a giant rug made of trash that nobody ever bothered to vacuum because they were too busy feasting. 5. Victorian ladies kept their waist tiny through diet and exercise. We see those impossible hourglass figures and assume it was just tight corsets. But the secret ingredient was often a pill filled with a live tapeworm egg. Women would voluntarily swallow a parasite and let it hatch in their stomachs so the worm would eat all their food for them. You could eat endless cake while the monster inside you grew to be 10 feet long, stealing every nutrient you swallowed. The worst part was trying to get it out, which usually involved holding a bowl of warm milk in front of your open mouth and waiting for the worm to slither up your throat to get a sip. It was the most horrifying weight loss program in the history of mankind. 6. Doctors have always been smart enough to wash their hands before surgery. You would hope the guy holding a sharp knife knows about basic cleanliness, but for a long time, doctors were actually proud of their filth. In the 19th century, a stiff coat covered in leftovers from previous patients was considered a badge of honor and a sign that you were a busy genius. When one smart guy suggested that maybe washing hands would stop people from getting sick, the medical community got offended and said a gentleman is clean by definition. They essentially argued that their status was a magical shield against germs. It is terrifying to think the smartest people in the room were actively refusing soap because they thought their fancy degrees made them immune to dirt. 7. Being the king's personal assistant was the most glamorous job in the kingdom. We assume that hanging out with royalty meant parties and free gold, But for one unlucky noble, it meant becoming the groom of the stool. This fancy title is just a polite way of saying you were the guy in charge of wiping the king's royal bottom after he used the bathroom. Believe it or not, aristocrats actually fought over this job because it meant you got alone time with the monarch to ask for favors while he was vulnerable. Imagine being jealous of the guy whose entire career depends on the consistency of the king's digestion. It gives a whole new meaning to the term brown-nosing because these guys were literally scrubbing their way to political power. 8. High heels were invented to make women look sexy. You see stilettos and think of supermodels, but they were actually invented for butchmen walking through filth. Butchers and soldiers wore elevated heels so they could wade through streets filled with animal guts and sewage without ruining their shoes. King Louis XIV started wearing them because he was short and insecure, not because he wanted to look pretty. So those fancy red-bottom shoes today are technically just expensive galoshes designed for stepping in manure. 9. The Romans made their wine delicious by boiling it in lead pots. We usually think of wine as a fancy drink for sophisticated people, but the Romans had a massive sweet tooth and no sugar. Their brilliant solution was to boil sour grape juice in lead vessels, which created a chemical syrup called sapa that tasted super sweet but was pure neurotoxin. They loved this lead syrup so much they put it in everything from sauces to desserts, happily poisoning themselves with every meal. It is hilarious to think that the greatest empire on earth was slowly going crazy and losing their minds simply because they refused to use a clay pot and really wanted their evening drink to taste like candy. 10. Medieval peasants were dirty swamp monsters who never touched water. If you believe the movies, then every single person in the Middle Ages looked like they just wrestled a pig in a mud pit. But this is totally false. The funny truth is that peasants actually loved bathhouses and scrubbed down daily because nobody wants to smell like a walking barnyard. The real stinky villains were the fancy folks who came later during the Renaissance who decided that washing was dangerous. King Louis XIV was basically a biological weapon of body odor who bathed twice in his entire life and probably terrified his own nose. So while the poor farmer was scrubbing his armpits with soap made from ash, the King of France was busy covering his unwashed body in so much perfume he smelled like a flower garden on fire. 11. Expensive perfume was originally made from whale vomit and beaver glands. You spray on a fancy scent to smell attractive for a date, but if you lived a few centuries ago, you were basically marinating yourself in animal secretions. The most luxurious ingredient was ambergris, which is a nice name for a waxy ball of vomit that floats out of a sperm whale's stomach. People paid a fortune for this ocean puke because it made the scent last longer. And it gets worse because the musk scent came from the glands near a deer's rear end. So the most romantic and wealthy people in history were walking around smelling like a mix of sea monster throw-up and a forest animal's backside, thinking they were the height of elegance. 12. Doctors in the past knew that smoking was bad for your health. Today we have warning labels on cigarettes, but back in the day, medical professionals thought tobacco smoke was a magical cleaning agent for your insides. In the 18th century, they actually developed a device for tobacco smoke enemas, where they would blow smoke up your rear end to revive you from drowning or cure a stomachache. They literally thought pumping a fog of nicotine into your backside was the height of medical technology. They even left emergency kits along the River Thames, just in case someone fell in and needed a quick puff in the wrong direction. It brings a hilarious and literal origin to the phrase blowing smoke up someone's rear. 13. George Washington had a nice rustic set of wooden teeth. This is the biggest lie in American history class, and the truth is honestly a horror movie for your mouth. The first president did not have a mouthful of timber like a walking tree stump. He actually wore a terrifying contraption made of hippopotamus, ivory, gold, and lead. The dentures were fitted with heavy metal springs that were so incredibly strong, they would force his mouth to shoot open if he relaxed his jaw for even a single second. He didn't look stern and serious in all those portraits. Because he was thinking about freedom, he looked that way because he was actively fighting a physical war against his own spring-loaded teeth to keep them from popping out. It was less about dental hygiene and more about having a heavy bear trap sitting inside your gums all day long. 14. The romantic castle moat was actually a giant ring of liquid sewage. Storybooks and cartoons always show castles surrounded by sparkling blue water with maybe a cute duck floating around. In reality, the moat was the final destination for all the castle's toilets and kitchen waste, meaning the fortress was surrounded by a stagnant, brown lagoon of excrement and rotting meat. It was an excellent defense system because no enemy soldier wanted to swim through a deep soup of human waste just to siege the walls. The smell alone was probably enough to make an invading army turn around and go home. So, living in a fairy tale castle basically meant you were trapped on an island in the middle of a toilet bowl that never got flushed. 15. Table manners and silverware have always been a sign of class. You probably imagine medieval kings daintily using forks to eat their roasted pheasant, but for centuries using a fork was considered an act of pure evil. The church actually preached that forks were sinful because God gave you perfectly good fingers to touch your food, and using a metal claw was an insult to divine creation. Men refused to use them because they thought tiny spears were too feminine and weak, so they just grabbed greasy meat with their bare hands. When their hands got too oily, they didn't use a napkin, they would just wipe their fingers on their own clothes or casually rub the grease onto the fur of the dogs running around under the dinner table. The most polite person at the banquet was just the guy with the least amount of gravy on his shirt. 16. Victorian men grew giant beards for medical safety, not style. You see old photos of men with bushes on their faces and think they just forgot to shave, but doctors actually told them that a thick beard was a high-tech filter. They genuinely believed that a massive wall of facial hair would trap the bad air and stop particles of disease from entering the mouth and throat. Essentially, they were treating their mustaches like N95 masks made of hair. The disgusting reality was that instead of filtering air, these beards just trapped leftover soup, coal dust, and saliva, turning their faces into a portable petri dish. So when a Victorian gentleman kissed his wife, he was also introducing her to the crumbs of every meal he had eaten that week, all hiding inside his medical face rug. 17. Leather clothing was always made with clean and pleasant chemicals. We love a good leather jacket, but if you knew how they made leather in the past, you would probably never touch it again. The secret ingredient to getting that soft and supple texture was fresh dog poop and lots of it. It became such a valuable resource that there was an entire profession of people called pure finders who walked around the streets of London with buckets collecting every scrap of dog mess they could find. They were called pure finders because the poop was used to purify the leather, which is the most ironic name in job history. So those dashing heroes in history books wearing cool leather armor were essentially walking around in cowskin that had been marinated in a bucket of canine waste. 18. The secret to sparkling white laundry was fermented urine. We love the smell of fresh linen, but the historical recipe for getting stains out of shirts was soaking them in a giant vat of stale pee. Urine contains ammonia, which is a powerful cleaner, so washerwomen would collect chamber lye from households and stomp on the clothes in a bucket of urine like they were making the world's grossest wine. They would then rinse it in the river, but you have to wonder if they ever truly got the smell out. So, when you see a movie with knights in shining white tunics, just remember that their dazzling outfit was likely scrubbed clean using the liquid contents of a chamber pot. 19. Fancy ladies carried flowers everywhere because they were hopeless romantics. You see paintings of women holding little bouquets called nosegays and think they were just accessorizing, but they were actually makeshift gas masks. The city smelled so aggressively awful due to the open sewage and rotting garbage that people needed to bury their noses in flowers just to keep from vomiting in the street. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was a survival tactic to avoid smelling the mountain of horse manure continuously piling up on the cobblestones. So, if a lady walked past you holding a rose to her face, she wasn't being coy. She was just trying to filter out the scent of the decomposing cat in the gutter next to her. 20. The local executioner was a scary figure everyone avoided. You would think people would run away from the guy with the axe, but he was actually the town's creepy pharmacist. People believed that human fat had magical healing properties, so after an execution, the crowds would rush to buy pots of rendered fat scraped from the criminal's body. They would rub this human ointment on their aching joints and broken bones, convinced that the grease of a dead thief was better than any doctor. It was a disturbingly literal way of recycling, where the bad guy became a tube of pain relief cream for the village elders who didn't ask too many questions about the ingredients. 21. Victorian wallpaper was vibrant and green because it was painted with poison. In the 19th century, everyone wanted their living rooms to look fashionable with a specific shade of Scheele's green. The problem was that this beautiful color was made using high concentrations of arsenic. People were literally pasting tons of deadly chemicals all over their walls just because it matched the furniture. When the air got damp, the wallpaper would release toxic gas, causing people to get sick in their own homes while wondering why they felt so terrible. It is the ultimate example of choosing style over survival, as they sat in their green rooms, slowly inhaling death just to impress their neighbors with their trendy interior design choices. 22. Doctors understood that drinking liquid metal was a bad idea. We know now that mercury is toxic, but back then it was the celebrity superstar of medicine, especially for treating mysterious rashes and social diseases. The treatment was absolutely wild because the doctors believed that the more you drooled, the more you were being cured of your sickness. Patients would take mercury and then produce pints and pints of saliva every single day, which the doctors cheered for like a sports victory. Your teeth might fall out and your gums would bleed from the poison, but the medical experts insisted that the gallons of spit meant the bad humors were leaving your body. They were literally poisoning you to death and high-fiving each other because you were drooling like a broken faucet. 23. Those cute velvet beauty marks were actually hiding a bumpy secret. In the 18th century, fashionable aristocrats covered their faces with little black fabric stickers called mouches, which is French for flies. While we think this was just a quirky style choice to look flirty, it was actually a desperate game of connect the dots to cover up horrifying smallpox scars. Since effective medicine didn't really exist, almost everyone had skin that looked like the surface of the moon, so they used heavy glue to paste velvet shapes like stars or hearts directly over the pockmarks. It was basically a real-life masking tool made of fabric, but if you sweated too much at a ball, the glue would fail, and your beauty spot would slide down your cheek, revealing the crater underneath to the person you were trying to impress. 24. Medieval dinner plates were actually stale slabs of bread you eventually ate. We are used to ceramic or glass plates, but back then, they used trenchers, which were essentially square loaves of bread that had been left out until they were hard as a rock. You would pile your greasy meat and stew right onto this bread block, and as you ate, the gravy would soak into the trencher, turning it into a soggy, meat-flavored sponge. At the end of the meal, you had a choice. Throw your plate to the dogs, or if you were still hungry, eat the plate yourself. It gives a whole new meaning to cleaning your plate when you literally have to chew through your own dishware, which probably tasted like wood shavings and old beef fat. 25. Removing unwanted body hair is a safe and modern beauty routine. We complain about razor burn today, but historical hair removal was basically a chemistry experiment gone wrong. In the Renaissance, women wanted smooth foreheads so badly that they used creams made of arsenic and quicklime to burn the hair off. This mixture was strong enough to remove the hair, but if you left it on for 10 seconds too long, it would also remove your skin and maybe a layer of your skull. They were voluntarily applying rat poison to their faces just to get a higher hairline. It really proves that people have always been willing to risk chemical burns and accidental death just to follow a silly fashion trend. 26. The city sanitation department was just a herd of hungry pigs. Before garbage trucks and street sweepers, cities were drowning in trash, so the official solution was to let pigs run wild in the streets. These sanitation hogs were allowed to roam freely, eating the piles of rotting garbage and waste that people threw out of their houses. It was a win-win situation until you tried to walk to the market and had to dodge a gang of aggressive, trash-eating pigs fighting over a cabbage core. The streets were basically an open-air barnyard where the line between a municipal worker and a farm animal was completely non-existent. It was efficient, sure, but it meant your morning commute involved stepping over livestock that was happily feasting on the neighborhood filth. 27. Fur stoles were worn purely to keep wealthy people warm in winter. You see those paintings of rich people holding a fur pelt and think it's just a status symbol, but it was actually a desperate bug trap called a zibellino. These furs were designed to attract fleas away from the person's body because they hoped the bugs would prefer the thick fur of the dead animal over the aristocrat's own hair. It was literally a wearable pest control device that you carried around at parties, hoping that your personal cloud of jumping parasites would move into the accessory instead of biting your neck. Imagine going to a fancy gala wearing a dead fox, solely because you hope it becomes a new home for the zoo of insects currently living in your armpits. 28. The best historical first aid for a cut was a handful of dirty cobwebs. If you scrape your knee today, you get a sterile bandage, but for centuries, the go-to medical advice was to run to the nearest dark corner, grab a dusty spider web, and jam it into your open wound. People genuinely believed that sticky webs were perfect for stopping bleeding, completely ignoring the fact that they were filled with dead flies, dust, and spider poop. It was like trying to fix a cut by rubbing the floor of a garage onto it. While the web might have stopped the blood flow, it also introduced a whole zoo of bacteria directly into your bloodstream, turning a minor scratch into a raging infection because nobody thought to check if the bandage had legs. 29. Rotten black teeth were the ultimate status symbol for the rich. In Elizabethan England, sugar was a brand new luxury import that only the super wealthy could afford, but it completely destroyed their teeth. Queen Elizabeth II ate so much sugar that her teeth turned black, and because she was the queen, everyone decided this was the coolest look ever. It became such a trend that people with healthy white teeth felt embarrassed and poor, so they would actually color their teeth black with cosmetics to fake the look of decay. They were literally painting cavities onto their smiles just to trick neighbors into thinking they were rich enough to eat candy all day. It is the only time in history where needing a dentist was considered a massive sign of wealth. 30. Ancient Roman bathrooms were private sanctuaries of peace and quiet. You probably picture a Roman senator reading a scroll on a marble throne in total silence, but the reality was a crowded social nightmare. Their public toilets were long benches with zero dividers where you sat thigh to thigh with total strangers making awkward eye contact while doing your business. But the real horror show was the wiping situation, because they didn't have toilet paper, so they used a communal sponge on a stick soaking in a bucket of vinegar that everyone shared. You would finish up and then casually pass the dirty sponge to the guy next to you, like you were passing the salt at a family dinner. It was basically a team-building exercise involving shared bacteria, and it is a miracle the entire empire didn't collapse from pink eye alone. 31. People didn't bathe because they were just too lazy to fetch water. You might think they were just being gross on purpose, but they actually had a very scientific and totally stupid theory called the dry wash. The belief was that your linen shirt acted like a giant sponge that sucked the dirt right out of your pores, so you didn't need to wash your body. You just needed to wash your shirt. Aristocrats would change their shirts 5 times a day and brag about how clean they were, while their actual skin was covered in a crusty layer of months-old sweat. It is like wrapping a garbage can in brand new gift wrap and pretending the trash inside has magically disappeared because the paper looks nice. They genuinely believed that fresh laundry was a magical force field against body odor. 32. Fancy face creams were always made of rare flowers and oils. Today, we pay for chemicals, but the high-end beauty secret of the past was bird poop. Specifically, the droppings of the nightingale bird were collected, dried, and smeared onto the faces of the elite to make their skin pale and smooth. It wasn't just a peasant remedy. It was a luxury treatment used by geishas and European actors to fix skin damaged by lead makeup. So the most beautiful people in the world were walking around with a thin layer of bird excrement on their cheeks, telling everyone it was a miracle cure. It really proves that humans will put absolutely anything on their faces if the packaging looks expensive enough. 33. Milk was often a white cocktail of chalk and pond water. In the 19th century, before food safety laws, the milk delivered to your door was often a science experiment gone wrong. Unscrupulous dairies would water down the milk to make more money, but since watered-down milk looks blue and unappetizing, they added plaster of Paris, chalk, or even pureed animal brains to make it look thick and creamy again. Sometimes they used dirty water from stagnant ponds, which meant your morning glass of calcium came with a side of wiggly worms and bacteria. People were drinking a mixture that was closer to wall paint than actual dairy, all while thinking it was a healthy way to start the day. 34. Staying at a hotel meant cuddling with total strangers. Today, if you book a room, you expect a private bed. But in the past, an innkeeper would just point to a large mattress already occupied by 3 other travelers and tell you to hop in. It was called doubling up, but it was usually tripling or quadrupling up with random people who had been riding horses all day. You would pay money to sleep thigh to thigh with a snoring merchant who hadn't bathed in a month and a farmer who smelled like raw onions. Personal space did not exist, so you just had to hope that the stranger spooning you in the middle of the night didn't have too many fleas jumping from his beard onto your pillow. 35. Women used deadly poison as eye drops to look pretty. In the Renaissance, big dilated pupils were considered the ultimate look of beauty. So women used drops made from the belladonna plant, also known as deadly nightshade. The name literally means beautiful lady, but the reality was that they were squirting toxin directly into their eyeballs. It worked to make their eyes look huge and dark, but the side effect was that they became legally blind and dizzy for days. So, these fashionable ladies would stumble around parties, bumping into furniture and walls, completely unable to see the people they were trying to impress. They were voluntarily blinding themselves just to have that doe-eyed look, proving that fashion has always been dangerous and stupid. 36. Fresh air was considered a silent killer that must be avoided. We open windows to air out a room, but our ancestors were terrified of the night air, believing it carried a poisonous vapor called miasma. Before they understood germs, they thought the air itself caused sickness, so they would seal their windows shut with heavy curtains and stuff rags into every crack. This meant entire families would sleep in airtight rooms, breathing in the same recycled oxygen and the fumes from their indoor toilet pots all night long. They were essentially suffocating themselves with their own body odors because they were convinced that a gentle, cool breeze from outside would instantly strike them dead in their sleep. 37. Underwear was designed to keep your private parts covered and clean. We assume historical bloomers were just like big shorts, but for a long time, women's drawers were completely crotchless. They were 2 separate legs joined at the waist with a giant gaping hole in the middle, purely for ventilation and easy bathroom access. The idea was that fresh air was better for hygiene than trapping everything in cloth. So women in giant hoop skirts were essentially walking around commando underneath all those layers. If a strong breeze hit a Victorian lady the wrong way, she was getting a lot more airflow than she bargained for, making a windy day a very risky event. 38. Leeches were only used for desperate medical emergencies. You might think attaching a blood-sucking slug to your face was a last resort, but there was a time when leeches were as common as aspirin. In the 19th century, people went completely leech crazy and would pop a few onto their bodies for everything from a mild headache to a bad mood. It was such a massive trend that France had to import over 40 million leeches in a single year just to keep up with the demand. Pharmacies sold fancy decorative jars just for holding your personal pet leeches on the fireplace mantle. It is hilarious to imagine a fancy Victorian lady getting ready for a ball and thinking the only thing missing from her outfit was a slime monster sucking the blood out of her earlobe. 39. The handkerchief was a symbol of elegance and refined manners. We associate a silk hanky with gentlemen and romance, but the practice is actually disgusting if you think about it for more than 1 second. Before tissues were invented, people would blow their noses into a piece of nice fabric and then fold the wet, snot-filled rag and put it right back into their pocket to save for later. It was considered polite to carry your own mucus around with you all day like a gross little pet, warm against your leg. If you wanted to be extra fancy, you would embroider flowers on the fabric so that, when you pulled out your pocket slime collection, it looked pretty. It is the equivalent of sneezing into your hand, and then just putting your hand in your pocket and pretending nothing happened. 40. The king's touch was a symbolic gesture of kindness. We think of royalty waving from a balcony, but people actually believed the king was a wizard who could cure diseases with his fingers. Thousands of peasants suffering from scrofula, a gross tuberculosis infection of the neck, would line up for days just to have the king touch their open sores. The king, who probably hadn't washed his hands since his coronation, would go down the line poking pus-filled wounds one by one without any sanitizer. It was a super spreader event disguised as a miracle, where the only thing being cured was the peasants' belief in the magic of royalty while sharing bacteria with the monarch. After all that, here's the real question. Which filthy habit from history did we not include that absolutely deserves to be here? And don't say something mild. Go full nightmare. Drop it in the comments and prove history can get even worse. Like the video. If this ruined your comfort, subscribe if you want more truths nobody sanitizes.